I have safely arrived at the heart of Dartmoor, and am staying at the Duchy Hotel in Princetown, just a stone's throw from the notorious prison. It is an ominous place. As we speak, I am enjoying the views out of the window from my writing desk. Distant Dartmoor looms through the mist. I look forward with great anticipation to my days of exploration, which will help me develop my latest Holmesian tale. I would like to tell you some of my experiences and how they appear in that most ghastly of stories, The Hound of the Baskervilles. I return after today's expedition out onto the expanses of Dartmoor, full of stimulation, ideas and thoughts about how this desolate landscape can inform my latest story. My guide took me to the very edge of a vast tract of boggy ground, here called Fox Tor Mires. I shall rework that in my yarn to become the Great Grimpenmire. We walked on, and not so very far away was a rather tumble-down farmstead, Nuns Cross Farm. Its location close to Fox Tor Mires inspired in me a location for the home of the villain of my piece, Stapleton. I have written some rough work this moment to capture some of the spirit of this fearful landscape. Let me read you something. We had come to a point where a narrow grassy path struck off from the road and wound away across the moor. A steep, boulder-sprinkled hill lay upon the right, which had in bygone days been cut into a granite quarry. The face which turned towards us formed a dark cliff, with ferns and brambles growing in its niches. From over a distant rise there floated a grey plume of smoke. This would set the scene, I feel, in the reader's mind. Now I think some dialogue between Stapleton and Watson to make my readers aware of the terrible nature of Dartmoor's landscape, and to chill their very bones.
Is it so hard to know?
Very hard. You see, for example, this great plain to the north here, with queer hills breaking out of it. Do you observe anything remarkable about that?
It would be a rare place for a gallop.
You would naturally think so, and the thought has cost folk their lives before now. You notice those bright green spots scattered thickly over it?
Yes, they seem more fertile than the rest.
That is the Great Grimpenmire, said he. A false step yonder means death to man or beast. Only yesterday I saw one of the moor ponies wander into it. He never came out. I saw his head for quite a long time craning out of the bog hole, but it sucked him down at last. Even in dry seasons it is a danger to cross it, but after these autumn rains it is an awful place. And yet I can find my way to the very heart of it and return alive. And so, dear listener, with this text I will set the scene, both for the moor itself and for the evil Stapleton's secret, the very heart of the moor where he keeps his fearful hound. We returned exhausted but fascinated from our travels out on the moor today. My companion took me to a large circle of stones in which others were arranged as huts in a village. This, he informed me, was Grimm's Pound, that had been inhabited in a deep past by an ancestral race who made a living on these slopes. This detail cannot be overlooked, and I absolutely shall include it, perhaps in a letter from Watson to Holmes. Again, to set the scene in the mind of the reader of the whole tale about just what a place Dartmoor is.
My dear Holmes, My previous letters and telegrams have kept you pretty well up to date as to all that has occurred in this most God-forsaken corner of the world. The longer one stays here, the more does the spirit of the moor sink into one's soul, its vastness and also its grim charm. When you are once out upon its bosom, you have left all traces of modern England behind you. But on the other hand, you are conscious everywhere of the homes and the work of the prehistoric people. On all sides of you as you walk are the houses of these forgotten folk, with their graves and the huge monoliths which are supposed to have marked their temples. As you look at their grey stone huts against the scarred hillsides, you leave your own age behind you. And if you were to see a skin-clad, hairy man crawl out from the low door, fitting a flint-tipped arrow onto the string of his bow, you would feel that his presence here was more natural than your own.
I have been mightily impressed by the nature of the weather here, so different to that found in the soft folds of the surrounding gentler farmed landscape. Here it is often wild with rain and mist driven before great gales. This very weather adds a sense of drama and excitement further to my tale. Here a passage with Watson describing the scene to his diary.
In the evening I put on my waterproofs, and I walked far upon the sodden moor, full of dark imaginings, the rain beating upon my face and the wind whistling about my ears. God help those who wander into the great mire now, for even the firm uplands are becoming a morass. I found the black tor upon which I had seen the solitary watcher, and from its craggy summit I looked out myself across the melancholy downs. Rain squalls drifted across their russet face, and the heavy slate-coloured clouds hung low over the landscape, trailing in grey wreaths down the sides of the fantastic hills.
For an early part of the story, I have kept the good detective out of the tale, in part to add suspense, but also to baffle my reader. This bafflement is shared by Dr. Watson, much to my amusement. Hear the passage in which Holmes makes a dramatic entrance back into the story. To set the scene, Dr. Watson is hiding in one of the primitive huts left out on the moor. He has spied a lonely figure and wishes to establish the identity of this mystery character, to himself believing that the figure he has seen is an escaped convict. You can imagine his fear.
All was sweet and mellow and peaceful in the golden evening light, and yet, as looked at them, my soul shared none of the peace of nature, but quivered at the vagueness and the terror of that interview which every instant was bringing nearer. With tingling nerves but a fixed purpose, I sat in the dark recess of the hut, and waited with sombre patience for the coming of its tenant. And then at last I heard him. Far away came the sharp clink of a boot striking upon a stone, then another and yet another, coming nearer and nearer. I shrank back into the darkest corner and cocked my pistol in my pocket, determined not to discover myself until I had an opportunity of seeing something of the stranger. There was a long pause, which showed that he had stopped. Then once more the footsteps approached, and a shadow fell across the opening of the hut.
"It is a lovely evening, my dear Watson," said a well-known voice. "I really think that you would be more comfortable outside than in."
For a moment or two I sat breathless, hardly able to believe my ears. Then my senses and my voice came back to me, while a crushing weight of responsibility seemed in an instant to be lifted from my soul. That cold, incisive, ironical voice could belong to but one man in all the world. "Holmes!" I cried. "Holmes!"
Whilst in Devon, I have heard a number of legends about hounds, both singular and plural, and these have often had almost supernatural appearances, which frighten many of the local populace. There is also a local tomb that we visited in the grounds of the church at Buckfastleigh, of a particularly unpleasant character, whose misadventures are retold as a warning to others who misuse their power and influence. I found all of these sources very helpful when writing, and I would now like you to hear a passage that I have written in an older form of English, as though from the 18th century. The company had come to a halt, more sober men as you may guess than when they started. The most of them would by no means advance, but 3 of them, the boldest, or it may be the most drunken, rode forward down the Goyle. Now it opened into a broad space, in which stood 2 of those great stones, still to be seen there, which were set by certain forgotten peoples in the days of old. The moon was shining bright upon the clearing, and there in the centre lay the unhappy maid where she had fallen, dead of fear or fatigue. But it was not the sight of her body, nor yet was it that of the body of Hugo Baskerville lying near her, which raised the hair upon the heads of these 3 daredevil roisterers, but it was that, standing over Hugo and plucking at his throat, there stood a foul thing, a great black beast, shaped like a hound, yet larger than any hound that ever mortal eye has rested upon, and even as they looked, the thing tore the throat out of Hugo Baskerville, on which, as it turned its blazing eyes and dripping jaws upon them, the 3 shrieked with fear and rode for dear life, still screaming across the moor. One, it is said, died that very night of what he had seen, and the other 2 were but broken men for the rest of their days. Come closer, friends. Dartmoor has provided such inspiration for this tale that I feel you should be introduced to its most fiendish character. I found in my walks hereabouts that the mist could infernally rise at any time, often obscuring the best views, and I decided that this very accident of weather could usefully be used in my tale to make the unmasking of my most evil creation even more dramatic. The way mist, fog, and low cloud crawled and crept over the landscape gave drama to every scene. Here is the description of the first meeting between Holmes, Watson, the detective Lestrade, and the hound of the Baskervilles. There was a thin, crisp, continuous patter from somewhere in the heart of that crawling bank. The cloud was within 50 yards of where we lay, and we glared at it, all 3 uncertain what horror was about to break from the heart of it. I was at Holmes' elbow, and I glanced for an instant at his face. It was pale and exultant, his eyes shining brightly in the moonlight. But suddenly they started forward in a rigid, fixed stare, and his lips parted in amazement. At the same instant Lestrade gave a yell of terror and threw himself face downwards upon the ground. I sprang to my feet, my inert hand grasping my pistol, my mind paralysed by the dreadful shape which had sprung out upon us from the shadows of the fog. A hound it was, an enormous coal-black hound, but not such a hound as mortal eyes have ever seen. Fire burst from its open mouth, its eyes glowed with a smouldering glare, its muzzles and hackles and dewlap were outlined in flickering flame. Never in the delirious dream of a disordered brain could anything more savage, more appalling, more hellish be conceived than that dark form and savage face which broke upon us out of the wall of fog. And to find out what happened next,